Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Boris Johnson put Britain into lockdown 4 weeks ago, but should he have acted earlier? As the virus tore through China and then seeded in Europe, the government turned to its scientific advisers to lead our response. But unlike other countries which swiftly imposed lockdowns to contain the virus, at first Britain sought only to slow its spread. In the first part of an investigative series looking into how we got here, our political editor Gary Gibbon reports.
Cheltenham Racecourse just over 5 weeks ago. Now silent. These images on March the 13th symbolised Britain's late entry into lockdown, lagging so many in Europe and beyond.
But let me also give you Rwanda. Rwanda went into shutdown before we did. Even Uganda across the border.
Chinese New Year in Beijing. London's Soho the same day. 2 months from showdown, why was Britain so slow? There's been much focus inevitably on Boris Johnson. Every bone of his body recoiled against the nanny state, and it showed.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
One cabinet minister said Boris Johnson was reluctant to boss the country indoors. He worried about the economic impact of a shutdown, that the cure might be more harmful than the illness. He worried too, the cabinet minister said, about the impact on his own optimistic political brand. He didn't want to look buffeted by events. The minister said for critical weeks the government did look as though it was behind the curve.
Obviously Mother's Day this Sunday. Are you urging people to stay away from their mothers, and will you be seeing yours?
I'll certainly be sending her my very best wishes and hope to get to see her.
But was Boris Johnson really defying advice from top scientists by allowing sports events and normal life to carry on through February and into March? Feeding into the Cobra meetings through the top 2 scientists, now household names, some 100 top scientists sit on an acronym soup of committees. Documents now released show that for weeks they were not beating down the Prime Minister's door to impose a full-blown shutdown.
I think this government is really listening to the scientists on this and is pulling on science advice and wants science advice.
Conversations with some of the top scientists at the heart of these committees suggest they weren't always comfortable that they had enough strong data to draw strong conclusions. They were conscious that some previous scares had not turned into full-blown pandemics, and they were working off a plan for something less lethal than COVID-19, the flu. One who was at the heart of these committees told us the thinking was, Plan A was always that we would just have an epidemic. The most you would do is close schools.
We thought that coronavirus was really like a very nasty flu. And we'd prepared for pandemic flu, and so our response was conditioned on this idea that this is something you can't stop.
There were stark warnings into the system as early as the 26th of February. One committee of experts warning in the event of a pandemic without action, the NHS will be unable to meet all demands placed on it. Another report on the 2nd of March, fed into the system, said it's highly likely there is sustained transmission of COVID-19 in the UK at present. The same report warns 80% of people in the country could be infected with COVID over time, and up to 500,000 might die. But experts involved in these committees that we've spoken to suggest they often struggled to believe what was happening in China would be replicated in a country like Britain with a better healthcare system. They also talk of a consensus amongst scientific experts that a draconian Chinese-style lockdown just wouldn't be tolerated here.
Asian countries were scarred by SARS from 2003 and MERS from 2004, which are deadly viruses. And so their attitude from the outset was that it has to be stopped at all costs. And that sort of conditioned 2 very different sets of responses. And I think that led to very different scientific advice.
People generally are thinking along the lines of the general consensus.
Do you think it might just be that there was a bit of groupthink going on there?
That's what I meant. Yes, groupthink. I do think so. And I think that the The groupthink is somehow picking up on what ministers are saying.
They know the politicians don't want this clampdown, and that's feeding into their advice.
I'm afraid I would have to say there might be something in there.
On the day Italy closed all its schools, Britain's top government scientists still felt such measures here wouldn't necessarily help.
We might look at it and we might say, well, OK, it would make a fractional difference, but compared to the impact on the workforce, compared to the impact on society, this just doesn't look a terribly attractive option.
Things that sound obvious, like we must cancel big sporting events, actually aren't in terms of the effect they have.
Early March, South Korea and Britain taking different routes on COVID-19. Boris Johnson was talking about slowing down the infection rate with some distancing measures, but no shutdown, protecting the most vulnerable. Many others might get the virus, enough maybe to create herd immunity.
One of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population, without really taking as many draconian measures. I think we need to strike a balance.
If you're saying we've got no choice, 60% of the population are going to get this, if you've got a 1% mortality rate, that's 500,000 dead. So it's a huge number of deaths. But I think the other issue with the herd immunity approach is that we don't actually know what the immunity is from COVID-19 because it's a brand new virus.
By March the 11th, when Italy went into full lockdown, Britain was looking more and more an outlier, a maverick. One committee of experts, the one looking at behavioural science, wrote on the 12th of March, trust will be lost in sections of the public if measures witnessed in other countries are not adopted in the UK. New modelling was fed into another committee of experts. It underlined death rates and predicted crushing pressures on the NHS. Some of those involved in that committee have told us the data wasn't that new, really. What was changing was public opinion, the government's sense of what it could now do and probably had to.
The time has now come for us all to do more.
The full shutdown came after an agonising few days in Whitehall, every hour of each day sure to be pored over by a future inquiry.
At the other side, one of two things will happen, which is either I will be, with Susan and a few of our other colleagues, in front of the Committee of Inquiry explaining why it is that we failed to prepare adequately for this Armageddon, which actually will not be an Armageddon, or we will sit in front of the committee saying, why did you spend all this money on an epidemic that never happened? Those are the two solutions, and I am basically ready for either of them. I've got my script prepared.
I would hesitate to use this as an analogy, because I don't particularly like the war analogy, but it may be a bit like calling the result of the Second World War in June 1940. When you can point to lots of mistakes, numerous mistakes that have been made by the British government, but in the end, it's the long haul that matters.
Lawrence Freedman sat for 7 years on the Iraq inquiry and has been studying the published documents on COVID-19.
But it's certainly, I think, a case to be answered, that they were slow off the mark. But we're talking days rather than weeks. That translates into lives, it's not a trivial matter.
I think there's little doubt when you look at the figures, and this might be with hindsight, that delay was critical, and we're paying the price for it very sadly now in increased numbers of deaths at a level that we didn't expect.
When they switched position and back to shutdown, the scientific modelers suggested strict social distancing would last 6 months. Only 4 weeks into shutdown, the costs of delay and the costs of implementation are coming into clearer view.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, joining me now from Edinburgh is Professor Dame Anne Glover, currently Professor at Strathclyde Institute of Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences and a former Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Commission. Thanks for coming on the programme, Dame Anne Glover. Tell me, first of all, listening to Gary's piece there, were you surprised by the things that the government decided to do, and also by those they decided not to do at the time?
Yeah, I would say that your report didn't make easy listening, to be honest. Am I surprised? Well, it's very easy to be surprised in retrospect, but what I was surprised at, I suppose at the time, was the fact that we had the learning from other countries that had been exposed to the virus, but we chose to think that somehow the UK would be affected differently. And that surprises me a lot.
Was that because of the scientists' thinking or the politicians' thinking?
Well, I don't have the answer to that. I mean, the scientists would have been providing scientific advice, but the job of scientists, particularly government scientists such as the Chief Scientific Advisor to UK Government, Sir Patrick Vallance, or the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, their job is to provide advice. Governments then make the decisions, and they will choose to accept or disregard advice. That is what they do.
And from what you know and from your own experience dealing with the European Commission, do you think that in this story, in this crisis, it is the scientists that have led the politicians, or perhaps the other way around?
Well, again, I don't know. And actually, to be fair, it is not the scientist's job to lead the politician. But it is a scientist's job to get the best possible information and the analysis of that information and to put it in a persuasive way to the politicians. And the difficulty is, and I've experienced this myself, is that sometimes the politicians don't want to hear what you have to say. So you have to be extremely firm and you have to be persistent in order to get the politicians to understand, in this case, the gravity of the situation.
Now, we may not know what the scientists are saying at the moment to the government and which scientists are saying it, because yesterday we were told by Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, that they will not publish the names of those involved in the advice or indeed the actual records, the minutes of the SAGE meetings that give the advice. Is that a good idea?
In my view, absolutely not. I think it's really important to be open and transparent. If for no other reason, is that that's the way that you ensure trust in what you're doing. I think if you lack transparency, then you're going to be struggling to have the trust of the population, but many others as well. In addition to that, I think that if you make membership of SAGE and other committees open, and I really understand no reason why that should be kept secret, then I think it offers the opportunity for others, not the usual suspects, to be able to feed in ideas because they know who they can contact and that they can provide perhaps some different thinking to the situation we find ourselves in.
And if the government loses our trust, you know, the trust of the population currently locked in their homes, largely, you know, voluntarily, what happens then to this war against an invisible enemy?
Well, then we have just the most amazing problem. I'd like to say that the British public have been utterly magnificent in how they've responded to this, because life overnight has changed beyond recognition for most people. And there are a whole group of people, those key workers, whether they're in the NHS or the care sector, or whether they're in supermarkets or delivery people, whoever they are putting their lives on the line for the rest of us. So the public really deserve the very best from our politicians and indeed our advisors.
Okay, got to leave it there. Professor Damon Glover, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.